Hello, welcome back to Factorio. In today's video, we're going to be talking about producing electric furnaces specifically for production science. So this video is more complicated than I thought. It's actually a really simple conclusion, and I'll talk about that here right after this intro. But I just wanted to give a disclaimer here. The video is a little bit longer, about an hour and 15 minutes. You do not need to watch the whole thing. What I would recommend that you do is you skip around to the chapter markers that I have. I have a chapter marker that talks about the belted design specifically. I have one that talks about on-patch specifically as well. What I'm going to say though is if you do stick around and you watch the whole entire video, there's going to be things that we're talking about that are not very specific to electric furnaces and production of them, but just more in general what you should clock and what you shouldn't clock. We're also going to talk a little bit about what you should do in terms of how you can improve the clocking specifically on when you're going into an electric furnace directly on patch, and there are some performance improvements that can be made from that. Again, there's going to be chapter markers for every single thing. Skip around, look at the things that you're interested in. If you're not interested in everything, that's completely fine, but this is about a week and a half's worth of research that I've done, and I'm trying to make this as presentable and straightforward as possible, and that just has turned into the length that the video is. So couldn't really work around that. Otherwise, I have two other videos that showed up before this one, so go check those out. One that talks specifically about how mining drills actually operate, which is kind of a precursor to this video, and also one that talks about chest chaining because it's used a lot in this video. So with those different things said, let's get right into the video. So here are the fast facts on what you need to know that this whole video is going to cover. So the first thing that we're going to cover that is going to be the most bang for your buck in terms of you're going to be going and crafting the stone bricks that you need is going to be maximizing direct insertion is going to be the best. Now the two highest flow rate items are going to be steel and are going to be stone bricks. So those we want to direct insert, and then within the constraints of a patch size. So keep that in mind. So for that reason, the compromises that make the most sense is going to be having less beacons around furnaces and directly inserting the from the electric mining drill. Why is that? So the main benefit that you get from directly inserting with an electric mining drill compared to a large mining drill is just the space that you wind up needing. The second thing that you benefit from directly inserting into it is that you can actually improve the performance of electric mining drills by eliminating the scans or small tiny inventory transfers as it eliminates or removes items from its internal buffer. If you don't know what an internal buffer is in an electric mining drill, go watch my last video where I talked about that in depth. But the benefit there is that you can only put the items here in a perfect clock exactly when you wind up needing them into this here. So you can see it fully runs out and then puts the items back in. That benefits you because unlike when you're belting the actual items, you have to have it constantly draining items onto this belt every single tick. You don't have to do that when you're directly inserting into a furnace. So you can have it all transfer in one tick, and that's going to be better for performance than if you are doing it spread over a very long period of time. Now, what you can't bypass is the actual mining operation. That is a fixed cost of it actually going and doing the mining. So what you can do is just eliminate the small, tiny piece by piece transfer that happens, and that turns out to be better. Now, this whole concept is far superior over belting the stone. This is about just even in the least optimized design that I'm going to show in this video today, there is already a 20% improvement that you're going to get just by doing this. Without even clocking or doing anything like that, is going to just be better immediately over pulling them off of a belt. Now, if you are going to be belting it, there's some things for you to be aware of. What I want you to be aware of and what we're going to discuss in depth in this video is what you should and should not be clocking. And this is going to be general rules of thumb. So if you think about something, my general rule and the way that I would think about it is how many scans or how many times is this inserter going to have to wake up to check if it has to craft and put something into here. So there's two examples where you do not want to clock things. That's going to be the stone input, which may be unintuitive because you're saying, well, this is a very expensive operation. We're pulling off of a belt. Well, how much are we actually saving? Well, if you think about the flow rate of this furnace here, we can have two furnaces going and putting into the assembly machine to get the 100 that we need per second. And I'll talk about ratios here in a little bit more in depth in a second, but just assume that we're crafting always 10 per second. So 50, 50, this is going to be 66.6 indefinitely repeating. So what you're going to then have is 1 minus 66.666 divided by 80, and that's going to be 16% of the time it's not doing anything. However, this gets even more drastic if you wind up saying, okay, let's multiply that by 60 in terms of the ticks. That means for 10 ticks, this is not going to be doing anything. However, that's not even true, because what's going to happen is for 8 of those ticks, this inserter is going to be swinging back. So, or rather for 4 of those ticks. So what you're really saving is about 4 ticks of this scanning this electric furnace, and because of the crafting rate, it's this net effect that's going to happen is this is going to scan one time the furnace, check it needs to put something, and then the next scan it goes and actually puts something into it. So you're saving 2 scans going into this. So that's not going to be worth it to add the overhead that comes from clocking. The second one that's not going to be worth it is the steel input. If you're guarding all the other inputs that are going into the machine, this is naturally going to start and stop exactly when this machine starts and stops. That's just going to happen. So if you have good clocking, you can get away with just not even doing this and just letting this just naturally rely on wakeless. That's going to be better. The second thing that actually matters for this, and actually the reason why the circuit network has an overhead, is because it is an overhead. What happens is every single time you enable and disable an inserter, it's going to go and get added to a global registry list, which I found by diving deep into some of the profiling that I did on the game. You can see it go and add the inserters to and from what's called a global registry. Those global registries are the things that are on a wake list. So the wake lists are these little yellow things. That means, hey, every single craft, go and check, can I put something in it? So if you're saving just, 1 or so of those scans, that means it has to be added to that list and then removed back from that list. So that has an overhead as well. So you just wind up not saving it. So in this case, the target items are going to be the ones that are in the 30 scans per second, like every other tick it's doing something. Those are good things to guard. Another one that's really good to guard here is going to be the output coming from an electric furnace. The reason for that is because of how slow it crafts. You can kind of effectively think about this because it's 50 per second, it's going to craft an item every single tick. Now, when you do that, that means that this is always going to pick up every single tick and item. Now, I've configured this in a very specific scenario where you have no back pressure, but let me remove the back pressure so I can show you what happens. If you do this, what's going to happen is you're going to see this is constantly picking up 1 item at a time, sometimes 2, sometimes 3, etc. But that's what it's going to be pulling out of here. And so you're seeing that this is constantly flickering its state, constantly turning on and off. There's constantly items being picked up, and this will indefinitely run. Now, what you can do to bypass even having to add in a clock here is you could actually just let this whole entire thing naturally back up when you do chest chaining like this, undo it, let all the items flow out of it. And now what you're going to see when you look at this is always picking up 16 items. Well, that's because we've created now naturally a buffer inside the electric furnace that's always going to have the full amount of stone bricks that we're going to need to have 4 or 5 swings coming into here. So, and that's what you're going to see here is now this inserter is just subscribing to this chest here and is then going to conditionally put items into it, and then those items are going to go out into the electric furnace. So now these are both basically synced up by the buffer. So that's just a thing you can do just in general, is you can reduce some of the clocking that you wind up needing and just output blocking this, let everything back up, and then everything can then afterwards all follow a cadence, which will naturally happen anyway in a real base because you're going to start and stop research where you're going to need production science. So it totally makes sense to go and optimize around that concept. The final takeaway that I'll give to you is always making sure you have back pressure. Talked about that with steel, talked about that with this individual electric furnace. Those are good concepts to have, but it also matters for belting. The best designs you're going to see in this video are going to be the ones that have a dedicated miner per inserter that's pulling an item off. And the reason for that is because this is going to always create back pressure. If you did this for two individual stack inserters on the same belt, then your maximum throughput on a single lane is going to be 120 per second. So the best thing that you can do is just make sure that you have, just in general, 2 miners for 2 stack inserters. It doesn't quite matter which lane they're going to be on, but in general, there's a slight optimization you can make here, is that you can see that this inserter is pulling from the inside lane on the right-hand side, and this inserter is pulling from the left-hand side. So consistently, the transport lines are going to get updated on both sides, and they're always going to have consistent back pressure in that way. That's a thing that you can do as well. With most of these optimizations, there's diminishing returns. The biggest improvement that you can have is just doing this direct insertion here. That's the biggest change you can make. And then you can reduce that even further by perfectly clocking the electric mining drill. Where things get more and more diminished is in this category of when you clock the actual inserters or not. Those are small. We're talking about 1 or 2% differences. Here, we're talking about a 20% difference. This is about a 1% difference. If you're picking up from an underground versus a straight line, again, we're talking about a 1% difference. So the differences when the economy of scale, what to focus on, do this. These things are less relevant, but are things that can continue to push your design to the absolute best if you incorporate all of those different techniques that I just talked about. So next, let's talk about ratios. So the target that we're trying to get to for every single one of these assembly machines that are crafting electric furnaces is 10 items per second. The reason that we're doing that is because of the recipe that Production Science has. So if you look at the recipe for Production Science, it's going to be 1 electric furnace for every 3 Production Science packs that are going to be crafted. So what that means is we're targeting normally on a belt to have a fully stacked half lane here is what we're kind of thinking about. And then you just double it for the other side. So if you think about that, that's going to be for half a lane is going to be 120 per second divided by 3 is how many furnaces we're going to need per second. However, because we have a double productivity, so 100% productivity, that means we cut that in half to 20. So 20 is the target, and we just need 2 buildings to be able to produce that. Now, supplying the materials is a lot harder than actually going and just the number of assembly machines we're going to need to craft. This is the easy part. The problem is actually getting the materials in. For the very first ratio that you're going to see quite often is people are trying to get an electric furnace that is going to have 11 beacons. The reason 11 beacons is a thing is because of the speed that you're going to get to. So at 11 beacons, you're going to have here a 50 per second output. Now we're going to need, in order to craft 10 per second, we're going to need 100 steel per second that we're going to need to craft. So that's actually a really nice ratio because then this is going to easily supply the amount we need because this is going to produce just over 100 stone bricks. So if we clock it right, this is all you're going to need to supply the stone bricks that you need. However, this presents a problem because you also want to directly insert steel, and then you're not going to get a layout that's going to be conducive to that with direct insertion of the actual stone bricks that are going to go in. So that's why you were seeing that example that I have down here, where we were using chest chaining to still get 11 beacons, but get enough space to get that 11th beacon in. So you'll see these kind of asymmetric type looking layouts to get this to actually work with 11 beacons. So this is going to be a common design pattern. And then falling back to a design sometimes where there's 3 furnaces coming in, that's going to be enough to also supply it. So those are going to be 2 different design patterns that you're going to see pretty often. So for the point of this video, we are only comparing red circuits coming in on a belt. We're not doing direct insertion. And that is just a choice that I made to simplify this for this video. So I wanted to talk about all the other things related to stone flow rate through here because it's one of the biggest costs for the whole build. So that's the second thing that I wanted to talk about. So that's the ratio. Steel is going to be pretty easy to supply because of just how fast the foundries are, especially since here in our design competition, we already have maxed out the research productivity on steel. So not research productivity, the research for the productivity of steel. So that can max out at 300%, and then we can get all speed beacons in here and still have the maximum productivity available to us. So that means we can easily supply the amount of steel that we're going to wind up needing to craft the electric furnaces here. So that's going to be most of the designs here. Directly inserting steel, directly inserting the electric furnaces wherever we can, and then it's optionally also going in directly inserting from a mining drill the stone. So, and what I'll say too is when we get now to this layout, this presents another problem, and that is a space constraint. Patches on Novice are only going to be a specific size. So when you're on a default patch size, you're only going to get about a 17 tiles worth of a actual patch when you're designing it. So that is a constraint that exists as well when you're thinking about these ratios. So you'll see a lot more of these trade-offs that are made where we have now 3 furnaces to get this kind of layout and still routing to all of the patches, the red circuits that we're going to need for the build. So that's what you're going to see is also going to be a pretty common design constraint that exists when you're going on patch. So Really, the balancing act here, when we're talking about ratios and everything, is the number of electric furnaces you have to an individual assembly machine 3, and then also the number of inserters that are picking up items from a belt, and then finally the total number of inserters or transfers that are happening. So those are the things to be aware of at a high level and the things that I'm going to be discussing here into the next segment. So continuing on where I left off in my last video, I talked about that mining drills have a operation where they actually perform mining, and then for the rest of the operation, it's going to be unloading items from the mining drill. Check that last video out if you want more details on it. But for that reason, they are flow rate based. So the only thing we could potentially do is we could limit the number of times that this mining drill is going to be interacting with a furnace. So I created two different scenarios here to test this out. The scenario on the left-hand side is where we're clocking the actual mining drill from running. So you'll see here on the left-hand side that this is always going to fill the stone occasionally right before it runs out. So this has been exactly clocked as good as I could to the actual mining productivity that I have here of 7,999. That is what I have set up. So this is only going to run when it needs to. And so I know at this particular speed, I can get, with the productivity multiplier and the beacons that are around it, I can get 6.5K per second that's coming out of here. So if you take that and you think about that in terms of ticks, you're going to divide this by 60. That means that we can produce 108 items in a single tick. And that's kind of about what I need to craft and get into here. So I've created a clock that is going to have a ratio of swings here, and this is going to run on an interval. Now, I've created a script to generate all these, and I'm still tweaking that. I haven't quite finalized it yet, but I'm trying to get it to the point where it can auto-generate clocks for me, which would be really cool. It's very crude, not quite there yet, but it did a decent job of clocking this. So I'm happy with that. The test that I'm doing here is clocking it so that it is constantly putting the items in. This is activated for 2 ticks, and the reason I'm activating it for 2 ticks is going to be 1, to ensure that it does the crafting and it does its actual mining, and it's not only doing the unloading phase. Because this is going to be producing 108 items per second, sometimes it'll go and fully fill the items that need to go in here, and we will get, all the way up to the maximum, which is about 134 items that we can get inside this slot. Sometimes it will, if you enable it just for 1 tick, it will just dump the items that are in its current inventory and it won't perform a mining operation again. So for that reason, you're always going to see that it's enabled for at least 2 ticks here so that it can actually go and perform its mining operation every single time. That's what I've clocked it around. Now, if you go to a higher rate, so about 16,000 mining productivity, that double step is not going to matter as much, because now you could maybe just enable it for 1 tick, but that difference is not going to matter in the grand scheme of things, so that's how I have clocked this. The one on the right here is going to have the exact same output clocking for the inserters that are dropping items to a belt. The difference is that this electric mining drill is constantly feeding this electric furnace. And so if you turn on the debug menu, you're going to see that there are these wake lists that are active, but you don't really see pulsing all that often. This is saying that it's disabled. In reality, it is disabled, and that's true because it's not performing that mining operation that I talked about before in the previous video. However, it is still constantly transferring the contents of its internal inventory into the electric furnace. And to prove that, I have a chart that I'm going to showcase here where we can see that. So I ran a benchmark of those 2 different setups that I created. And what I wound up looking at here was I was seeing at, okay, what is the difference between the clocked version and the unclocked version? You can see a drastic decrease in the entity update time. So this is the first example that I'm going to show, and the only example that is where it's actually worth to clock mining drills. And the only advantage that you can get is exactly limiting the flow rate that's coming out of it. You can see this also when we wind up looking at the comparison of the unclocked versus the clocked version here. You're seeing that there is a constant elevated entity update time, and that's because every single tick it is transferring items out of its inventory and dropping it directly into the furnace. Whereas in the clocked version, you're really just oscillating around the peaks here. These peaks still exist because it has to perform the mining in that single tick. We've optimized the clocking so that it exactly drops the items into the furnace based on the mining productivity that we have. This doesn't matter. It doesn't matter your mining productivity that you're going to have, because we had 16,000 was our mining productivity. You just see these spikes spaced out every other, but nowadays spikes would just be much larger. It'd be twice the amplitude. So mainly it's just clocking for the throughput that you need, and that's what you wind up doing, because what we're saving here are the constant checks that the furnaces are doing over here in Factorio every single time, every single tick, to constantly top this up to 134 items. So you're seeing this here. You'll see it occasionally kind of fluctuate between 134 and 133, and that happens right when the mining operation happens. So that's again kind of emphasizing the reason why I wind up enabling them for 2 ticks and not just 1, is so that it's always making sure that it can drop and actually do the mining operation every single time. So that's kind of a high level, is if it's worth it to actually go and clock your direct insertion mining drills. It absolutely is. Next, let's talk about inserter clocking. There's a couple things that you're going to probably want to clock, and there's things you're going to not want to clock in this kind of a build. So I'll explain here in detail what's going on. So for this particular test, the first one that I want to focus on is stone. So stone is going to be something that is, in one sense, going to be the most expensive because it's being constantly picked up from a belt. Now, there's some things you need to consider when you look at this. You would say, okay, I might want to clock this inserter that's picking up items and putting them into the actual furnace. However, you need to think about the throughput of the inserter as it's picking up items from a belt. So the first thing that's happening here is more of a design choice that's a good thing, is that we have a dedicated lane per inserter. This creates a sense of back pressure as it comes along. So if you think about following this line here, this comes in here, and on the inside lane, this right lane, is being picked up by this inserter. And then the outside lane, this left lane, is always being picked up by this inserter. So it's minimizing in that sense the decisions of what it needs to pick up, and can always interact with a non-moving belt every time it comes back and swings around. So that's a good thing in this particular sense, because it's only interacting really with just this one lane, and that's all it has to wind up doing. Now, I've never actually tested if one belt is already moving and the other one is not, if that has an update time performance on the actual inserters. I've never had a good way of testing that, but it might be something to follow up on in the future. But in general, this means that it can always have the items in front of it that it always needs every time that's swinging. Now, let's think about the ratios of how fast we're consuming something here. So a stack inserter that's legendary can pick up 80 items per second off of a belt. The consumption rate here is 66.66 items per second, because we're crafting 50 items and then the productivity multiplier that we wind up having of 1.5. So if you think about that, if we're picking up 80 items per second, well, what are we really saving here if we wind up clocking it? Because we basically have to run it all the time. So if you think about that, that'd be 66.666 divided by 80, and we'll just do 1 minus so we can get the difference. That means only 16% of the time it's not going to actually be running. So what that actually results in, if it's constantly running like this, is you just see a little pulse that happens. So per second, you're going to save 1 wake list that comes up. So this is a point where I don't think, I will tell you right now, clocking is not worth it. It's not going to be worth it for this, because you're adding an overhead that comes from the circuit network. And every time you add or activate and deactivate inserter, it goes onto a global wake list that is a list that's in the game. So if you think about that, you're like adding always constantly like, hey, register this inserter, unregister it, register it, unregister it. So you're doing all this extra complexity for just saving 1 pulse per second. So this is a case where it's just not going to be worth it, and the things you should be optimizing for is the lanes, and giving like dedicated back pressure all the time for the inserter is going to be better in this case. And we'll prove that. So this particular test is set up where it has one inserter that's constantly pulling in that's unclocked. So this is going to be version 1.0 that's here. Version 1.1 is a version where we have 5 continuous swings, and you'll see that here, where we have 5 continuous swings, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and is all controlled by the circuit network. And then over here, we have another version that is going to have more of a staggered hybrid type approach, where it's going to have more pulses. So sometimes it'll pulse for 2, sometimes it'll pulse for 3, and it goes on and off like this. Now, this could potentially help you if you don't have a dedicated lane in your design, but in reality, you're just kind of compensating for a not optimal design choice, and it's more of a layout problem at that point. So the circuits can help you compensate for that problem, But in reality, the question is like, does that actually make a difference? If you wind up clocking these, it'll help you in other cases, but because of the way this design is laid out, it doesn't help you at all. And actually, in reality, it'll make the performance worse because you're adding extra decisions for this insert. So let's demonstrate that here by looking at the actual results that I have. So over here, what I have outlined is those 3 different designs. Version 1 is unclocked, and you can see that it performed better than its counterparts. You can see version 1.1 is the version where we have one continuous 5 swings. So this has less control network update time, which we see here. This is that the of 75 microseconds that's being taken up by it. And then when we go and stagger it, so we do 2 and 3 pattern, now we have a higher control update time. So we haven't really reduced the entity update time, and those have stayed consistent in both of those cases. And so overall, the best case scenario was actually just the unclocked version because we removed the overhead that we added from the control behavior update time. And we've now transferred that decision-making process to just reducing the number of decisions that need to be made. So this is an example where clocking the stone just wasn't worth it. Now you might think, okay, well that makes sense because the stone furnace, there's 2 of those stone furnaces that are constantly running. Well, what happens if you had a 3 furnace layout? So let's go and dive into that next. So what you have now in front of you here is a 3 furnace design. This is a design that I came up with to demonstrate this process, and I was curious about optimizing and seeing the general performance of a 3 furnace design compared to a 2 furnace design. The benefits of this particular design is that I've very explicitly chosen the way that the belts are going to route. So if you follow this one belt here, this belt is going to be interwoven and is going to go to 1, 2, 3, 4 furnaces. The other belts that are coming in here are going to go across here to 1, 2, 3, 4 furnaces. So this means that these furnaces themselves, since they're taking a third of the amount that the assembly machine is going to need, that means that each one is only going to have to craft 33 1/3 stone bricks per second, which is very easily hit with the number of beacons that we have around here. Now, with that being said, since we have 33.3 per each one of the stone bricks that we're going to craft, 33.33 times 4 is going to be 133 stone per second. So very easily we'll be able, or stone bricks. Now we need 2 times that with stone divided by the productivity ratio, so there's 177.7. So we should always have back pressure for bringing in 240 per second into here. Now this presents an interesting problem that comes about with clocking. So when you're clocking things, one of the concepts that you want to optimize for that we've seen in previous videos that I've presented is that you want to increase the number of swings. Just like the example I showed before, having 5 continuous swings was better than staggered 2 and 3 swings. That's because the number of signals you're sending across the network to these individual inserters is reduced, the longer period of time that that circuit network is enabled for. Now, the issue that presents itself is that the spacing can matter now between inserters. Why does the spacing matter? So if you look at this in the debug menu, you see the occasional wakeless flicker that comes on here. What's happening is at the end of the line here, because this is alternating between 4 swings and 5 swings to hit the ratio that we wind up actually needing. There's actually a nice description that my script generated here where we can see 40/9 swings is how much we're going to need to craft one of these electric furnaces across 3 furnaces as an input. So if you look at that, 40/9, that's going to be 4.44 repeating swings that you're going to need of 16 items that are going into here. So that means that sometimes we swing with 4 times and sometimes we swing 5 times. The problem that happens when you swing 5 times here is the spacing between these 2 inserters now all of a sudden kind of matters. So if you think about what's going on in each of these ticks, is that when it swings 4 times, what it can do is it will be able to pick up 32 items from this, so this would reduce it down to 16 like you're seeing here. So this reduces it, it moves a little bit forward, we get now to 20. So what's going on now is there's going to be now another dedicated lane for it to grab from, which should be fine. But as it comes back and swings again, now you see that this full inside lane has been fully consumed and it's coming back to swing again. And now when it comes back here, it's going to start picking up from the remaining items to this 16 that's here. So this works fine in the 4 case, but then occasionally, just because of the timing on the belt, now there's only 12 items here and there's a gap. So what's going to happen is it's going to now have to wait longer and can miss its window. So now the inserter has to be active longer, scanning the belt, trying to find it, and it will get to a point where now you can see these 2 inserters, their timing are completely off. That's because just in a pulse of 5 swings, the actual amount that you can deliver across these 3 belts is just not going to be enough. So that's something to consider when you're clocking this, is that we want to balance the control time, but we also need to be cognizant of the throughput on the belt during that time when it's come to a complete stop. We will always be able to transport enough of the items, but the inserters are now interacting with a belt that is running out of materials and is moving. So that's a downside if you're doing multiple swings, and now the spacing between them matters. So if you had a larger buffer, let's say instead of just the 3 tiles that are here, if we had, let's say, 5 tiles or so, that would have been completely fine for the amount of items that we're going to need. But because of the way this design was laid out, that's a limitation on these 2 individual inserters. This was something that I found out as I was testing it, and I figured it would be helpful to share. So that is a thing that you need to consider. So for that reason, the design on the right compensates for that. What it does is it still has the same ratios, but what it does is it winds up breaking out the swings to be a very consistent period where it can at maximum swing twice back to back. And you're seeing that here, that now these inserters are constantly in sync. So now it's taking into account how many items can actually transport across this belt every time. At the downside of having multiple control signals, more pulses on off that are happening. But this handles and compensates for the, in reality, a bad design choice layout to maximize both things. So the next version, what I wound up creating here is just for point of comparison. We have version 1.0, this is version 1.2 that has the higher control update time, but is always interacting with a non-moving belt, or has enough so that it doesn't have to have out of sync longer activation times for the inserters. The next version is where I took all the clocking completely off from the inserters. So when you would look at this, as I've been trained to look at things, I'd say, oh my gosh, look at how many flickering lights that are coming on here if I open up the debug menu on the individual clocks, like not the clocks, but the wake lists that are turning on and off for all these furnaces. Say this must be worse in terms of performance. But in reality, this is actually better. And it turns out that it actually is just not worth to clock these inserters at all because of the extra control update time that comes across them. So, and then finally, the last thing that I wound up doing is I said, well, is steel clocking worth it? And I'll tell you right now that steel clocking here, clocking the inserters that are inserting the steel, is not worth it when you happen to be clocking all the other inputs. So that means that these are naturally going to sync up and have the number of swings that you're going to need back to back to back, because of the speed at which this is going to craft, and the rest of all the other inserters are all putting items exactly on time and are all synchronized. So this crafting cycle, when it's going to need new materials, is always exactly in sync with all the rest of the inserters. So you don't need to clock this at all. There's no need for it. So those are the 3 variations. So again, just looking at this, if I would say, hey, if I'm looking at these 3 designs, and let's go and clear all the extra the inserters and all the network, the circuit network that exists. So if I looked at all of these, my first impressions looking at the debug menu, I would say, oh, these must be superior because they don't have all these extra flickering lists here. But you need to take into account how many you're saving really by adding control network update time. So again, so this is version 1.0, this is version 1.2, this is version 1.3, and this is version 1.4. And just to remind you again, this is the version where we are staggering the clocks. So there's 4 swings and then 5 swings back to back that have the issue with the pickups sometimes. This is the version where we send more control signals, but now they are never interacting. They always have enough room on the actual belt. In this version, we take all the clocking off of the stone inputs. And in this version, we take also not only the stone inputs off, we also take the steel off as well. Now, coming back to the results here, what you're going to see is those 4 different designs that we just talked about. So, same kind of pattern emerges. If you have the first version, which has a lower control behavior update time, because then the version 1.2, where we wound up staggering the inserters to compensate for entity update time. In fact, in this particular case, the entity update time did not go down. It stayed actually, it was actually higher. And that may just be from the run differences, but overall, it turned out that just having the extra swings, start, stops, did not help anything. And it only increased the actual entity, it increased the entity update time and the control behavior update time. So it just was something that just, again, you're saving 1 tick, it's not going to be worth it to do that. So in that particular case. Now, what was interesting to me as well is that when we went to the point where we wound up removing the stone clocking altogether, the clock stone, that wound up performing better than the version where we were sending more control signals. So you can see the control behavior update time is lower. Now the entity update time was just slightly higher for this, but we're talking a very small difference here. So a decrease of like 0.78%. Just keep in context, like the differences here we're talking about in all 4 different cases here, we're talking about a 1% spread. This is to the point where you could even consider, like, do you even care about this? And I'm kind of telling you, you don't. So in this particular case here, the best scenario was a design here that had the unclocked stone and the unclocked version of the of steel as well. So that just wound up being the overall best and the most consistent in all of the tests. And again, you're saving nothing by just going and adding that extra control update time cost. And the overall time that's being spent by those entities was all the same. The reason I bring this up is because there are times where I fall into this trap where I think that I should just be going and clocking literally every single thing, and that's just going to be a better thing to do. It turns out that in a lot of cases, like this with stone input, because of just how high the volume is that you're going to be putting it in, if you're already clocking the output here, and all the rest of the items that are coming in are going to be anyway, you're maybe saving 1 waitlist item, it's just not worth to do it. And it's just going to be overall a better thing to just leave them unclocked and let the game engine just run it normally. So it also reduces complexity a lot of times. You just wind up having less wires you need to run everywhere. Although I am personally very proud of the actual way that I routed all the wires in this particular case, having everything coming in from the side here and having 1 continuous lane that spirals out. I do like the actual pattern. But the point that I'm trying to get to is that you can see just how many more wires you wind up having to run for a lot of these other builds, just in order to get individual networks to all the different items that you need to get to. So the main takeaway from where I'm getting at with this particular point of what you should be clocking is think about how many updates you're saving. And kind of as a rule of thumb, if you're saving maybe 1 or 2 updates per second, it's just not going to be worth it, and just leave it unclocked. Just clock the other items, like the more expensive one, which is the stone output, because it would be picking up 1 item at a time otherwise, constantly. So this is a good case to clock the output and let the input just naturally go and bring the items in on demand when it needs to. So next, let's talk about all the designs that were tested. So here are the overall run distributions that exist here. So you're going to see there's a very obvious drop-off that happens. And if you look at it, although the naming conventions are a little bit harder to read, this is the first time you see the change from Belta to on-patch. So this is where it's very clear that on-patch designs are going to be superior. Now there's some optimizations that you definitely can make, as you can see here, and this is where you gain the most in terms of the optimizations you can make. Most of the designs that were tested were there was a very obvious kind of drop off in terms of their overall update time distribution as you wound up getting better and better and better, the diminishing returns that existed. But for the moment that you went even to, in this particular case, the worst performing on-patch design, all these optimizations didn't matter because just literally going directly into a stone furnace and having the actual on-patch mining drill was just far superior. Now there was optimizations that can be made from that, which is in terms of which we'll discuss here in a little bit, but that's the first conclusion that is very clear. You can argue a little bit about some of the noise potentially in some of these designs, 1 or 2% here, but these are the big things we're looking, right? Always when we're optimizing things. Now, a couple things just for transparency. All of these were run all at the same time. I wound up rerunning or adding a couple different variations of the 3 furnace design to specifically give the explanations that I had. So those were run independently, but they're also plotted here for the charts themselves. So for this, where I'm going to get into now is I want to talk about just some of the statistics here. So in all of the designs that were existing where we had the belted designs, you can see the entity update time has a much larger increase compared to all the other designs that exist here. And so let's go through and I'll grab the actual table that exists and we can talk through that. And so we can have this up here and I'll put this underneath it so we can look at it. So what you wind up seeing in terms of the percent decrease from the best designs is you can see that, okay, we have very small variations, 0%, 0.23, 1%, we're having, and then individual changes. We're talking about 1% deltas. There's some larger breaks and changes, but overall there's still these larger deltas. The moment that you switch from on patch to belted, you go and you have a 18% decrease in performance. And actually from the best on-patch design that myself and a few other people on my Discord server collaborated on, that is a full drop of 34% in terms of update time. So it's very clear that going on-patch can be better. So, and that is directly correlated in the entity update time. That's where you see the very first drop off going from 960 microseconds to 792, just for the sheer fact that we're removing all the inserters that we wind up needing and reducing, and we can actually finally clock the mining drills. That's a huge bonus there. So if you want like a quick short summary here, go on patch. It's just going to be better. There's no doubt about it. It's very clear here from all the results all put together that they exist. Now, I want to do 2 things as we go into the next portion of this. I want to talk about the on-patch designs, the best one that we have, and a couple different variations. And I also want to talk through the belted designs. Before I get into that though, I want to explain why this was difficult to test. In the last 2 videos, I talked through different components that exist with the inserters, how they interact with chaining them, and the bigger item that I had and why I had to delay this particular video for so long was that I needed to understand why I was not getting a good sample on a lot of these designs. So ultimately, the way these were tested is I ran these for 64,000 ticks, and I ran them then for 6 runs apiece. Now, the reason I chose to do 64,000 runs is because of the differences in the update time. You can see a belted design has a relatively consistent wave pattern that exists between them. And you can see that that kind of is pretty consistent with the 4 different designs that I wound up showing before. They're relatively the same, slightly different signature depending on the clocking, but they all wind up looking about the same in terms of their overall average update time. The moment that you I'll just grab a random on-patch design. Wow, that is a very big difference. Why is that? Well, that's because all the mining drills are all synced up and clocked at the same time, that they're going to actually be doing their mining operation. So when they actually perform their mining, this happens now on a very fixed cadence. So the downside to on-patch is, it's not really a downside because this is scaled way beyond the amount that you would normally have. And again, everything is cloned at the same exact period. So what that means is that every single design is copied, cloned, they're all exactly at the same tick. They're all going to be doing the same thing. So this is not going to be an 8 millisecond update time spike in your actual real game, just to be very clear about that. Just literally the fact that a bot places the mining drill at a different time, meaning that these spikes are going to kind of just normalize out. So it's not as big of a deal. But what it does mean is that because mining drills perform all their mining in 1 tick because of the high mining productivity that we have, you're going to see a big difference in the spikes. And then especially once you go from a design that uses like small electric furnaces because they're so much smaller, like this particular design, and then you go to a big mining drill, the moment that you go to a big mining drill, you're going to have an even more drastic difference in terms of the time period in between. So let me go grab one that uses big mining drills. Here you can see that very clearly. The big mining drills can perform a lot more in this particular tick. So what I needed to do in order to have a good average is I needed to have a large enough sample where these periods here would all line up across all the different designs. So that's why I wound up doing this and taking longer to have a good full in-depth analysis, because I needed to figure out where the variations were coming from, and it was the mining drills. So now that I know how they behave, now I know how to test and benchmark them. But that means it's harder to benchmark because you have to line up these large spikes to get a good one. So it's mainly a problem for benchmarking, but want to bring it out so that you can understand kind of the signature differences when you're doing an on-patch design. But clearly, overall, if you look at just a belted variation and the average update time that comes from that in these giant waves, and then you go and compare that against a on-patch, the overall average is just clearly going to be better, just because of just the reduction in the average time that's being spent at just the cost of this more spiky design. So, but on average, it's still better, which is clear by the results. Okay, I think I've shown enough of the graphs. Let's go and talk about the actual designs. So next, let's talk about the belted designs. So for this, I want to highlight briefly first the two lowest designs. So the two lowest designs here are going to be this version here that you're seeing on the left, and these are ordered in the order in which they performed, so that it keeps it simple. But I'm going to talk about the first two because they had like the larger kind of like step downs. Everything else afterwards, if you're looking at the chart, has kind of like a relatively smooth, kind of slightly diminishing returns at different steps. So I've picked a few of these designs just to highlight them so that we can talk about them in terms of why they performed better or worse in general. So the first design here that had kind of a larger step between this version and this version here is mainly just because of the extra inserter that is pulling items off of two belts and going into this furnace here. You could make some arguments about potentially that some of the clocks are constantly updating here, but I think the main thing that's coming from this is just that you happen to have an extra inserter that's going into the actual furnace. The next design here actually had an issue, so it performed well in the benchmark when you had it under full back pressure, but because this only has 10 beacons, it actually cannot keep up with the full production rate of this particular assembly machine. So that was an issue that I saw just in this design. It didn't show up because it would take a very long time to actually happen. So just to highlight this, if you run this for a very long time and let this legendary chest fully back up, it would take a extremely long time for that rounding error to happen. So I didn't see it when I validated the original designs, but it did show up here when it actually ran for a longer period of time. And now that I've been running this for multiple hours, as I've been either editing, talking about the designs, or incorporating different things, you can see that this very slowly runs out of items just because this is just ever so slightly underclocked. So that's actually an issue with this design, but maybe the original designer or Diantrix doesn't know about, but that is an issue that kind of is existing with this, but it wouldn't show up for hours. So, but otherwise, just the main other issue that potentially happened was just the way that the red circuits are routed here. So you wind up having a case here where this is always constantly preferring to always pick up from the left lane here and not the right. In reality, in this design, this extends and goes further up this way. But one of the things that just was kind of happening with this is that just because of the way the belt is routed, this inside lane is very rarely actually accessed and the outside lane is accessed more often. So with slightly different way of routing it or just splitting it into two lanes, this would have been a little bit more evenly distributed, and then the lanes would have been balanced a little bit better. So those are some issues that were with this design. The main pattern, though, that I want to highlight just as we're talking about these is you're going to start seeing this like chesting chain here. There's a chest chain here. You're seeing that, and another chest chaining that's going on here with a design that I had created, which I've highlighted in the past already. So there's this kind of chest chaining that's going on. So you're not gaining a whole bunch here by just having a lot of extra beacons just to get around this electric furnace, just to happen to craft it, and then still using the 3 inserters. Now, that's not always the case, but it is something that you're seeing as a general trend for those that were performing worse compared to others. Now, as we go up out of the original designs, and just some housekeeping items, if you see the number here, that's the design index on the original submissions that were submitted for Purple Sign. So I've taken a handful of them, about 7 different designs, and I've taken those designs and tested them, and where I didn't have enough information or variance between the rest of the designs, I've created my own version to go and test that out. So if you see this number, 24, that's what that means. The 80 is the number of items it produces together in one design, and then ultimately if it's belted or on patch. So So out of the designs that were originally submitted in the competition, the two best performing ones, and again, just to highlight this, if you're looking at, and we can even just make this a little bit bigger here so that we can see it, the two best performing designs were the designs that we have here on the left. So the 160 belted version from M, and then the design number 23 from Warbecue. Now, the differences between these is less than 1%. These are almost exactly identical in terms of their performance characteristics. But I found that interesting because of how different their design philosophies are. So, in this particular design, you wind up seeing that there is a sharing of the steel itself. They have different ratios of beacons, but the main difference that I want to kind of just wanting to highlight here is that this is using 3 furnaces versus using 2. Still the same number of inserters that are swinging, but when you think about it, the number of transfers that are happening is identical. So in this case, it's clocking the actual stone, and over here it's unclocked, or sorry, it is also clocked as well, so the stone is also clocked, but then the number of transfers are happening are the same. This is a 1% delta between these two designs, even though these are a very, very similar layout. So in general, like the advice that I give here and the things that I've learned from this is that really the thing to optimize for, mainly you can talk about like 1% or 2% deltas, but really just the thing to think about is how many transfers are happening of an item from one place to another place and minimizing those transfers as much as possible. So very similar clocking techniques between the two different designs, very different layout in terms of beacon count and ratios that are there. But this is a design that produces 160, and this is a design that produces 80 per second. And you'll wind up seeing that there is a 1% difference between the two different designs. So we're definitely getting to the point of diminishing returns. Now, I created a version that is still belted that improved ever so slightly upon that, because it didn't have now the clocking of these individual inserters, which we saw at scale now. So that's just kind of highlighting that case where these are unclocked, and that was a difference here where they were clocked, where that just wasn't worth it. And then again here where the steel going into the actual electric furnace is unclocked, and then both of these designs did have that clocked as well. So you can kind of see that as a difference there. So now, as we went on, now Warbecue wound up submitting a design that surpassed even this version that I created, because it incorporated all those principles while minimizing the total number of beacons total that were being used in this design. So I wanted to highlight that because, again, if we look at this, you can see that there is still a significant drop off, and there's 4 designs that are from Warbecue. I'm not going to go over them because it's mainly just I was looking at some very small characteristics. They're tiny little differences. But the main thing I want to focus on is the best version that was created, which is this version, 11 beaconed, 80 belted by Warbecue. So the ultimate best design that existed here was actually incorporating a lot of the kind of techniques that I had talked about. So it's having constant back pressure, so 2 mining drills per 2 inserters. So that was a good design choice that was made here. Whereas you can see in this design that I had here, there's 4 per lane. So just having constant back pressure, minimal movement on the belt, and they're always being able to pick up constantly and unclocking these was the best kind of overall rounded choice. The next thing that exists here is there's being inserted directly into a chest, but the main point of why I think this one works so well, even though it is still using this extra chaining of this chesting here, is mainly just due to the compact nature of it. This has significantly less beacons than any of the other designs. If you look at this has 104 beacons versus this is making twice that amount, but has 154 beacons. So there's technically less beacons in this particular design, but there's 3 furnaces. So in this particular design, there is less furnaces. So there's less furnaces and less inserters picking up from a belt. And again, there's a good ratio of that actual, the miners going into these dedicated lanes with back pressure. And this kind of goes to the point that I had made in the previous video where the number of miners that you have is kind of irrelevant. What is much more relevant is going to be, because they're flow rate based, right? So what's more relevant is routing them very cleverly so that you are always having back pressure. And that's where a lot of the designs here didn't always constantly have back pressure. And you can see that where they wind up running out of stone occasionally on certain lines, like right here, for example, where it's sometimes picking up from one side, sometimes picking up from the other side. and most of the designs had a similar issue with that. Now, so it seems like the best of the both worlds in terms of when you're finally getting down to this is just having the least number of inserters picking up off of a belt, always having constant back pressure. This wound up being slightly cheaper and clocking it. The only improvement that I think could be made on this is just allowing this to have full back pressure, have 4 slots in here, and then just unclocking this particular inserter, and you probably don't need it. I didn't test it, but that might be an improvement you can make. Again, we're talking less than 1% delta. It probably doesn't even matter to do it. So kind of keep that 80-20 rule in mind. 80% of the work happens in 20% of the time, and then getting that like extra 20% of the time takes 80% of the work. I need to remind myself of that given how in-depth I went with this particular section, or this particular part of the Purple Science design. So that's where I wanted to kind of highlight this, is that this design does a lot of really good things. So there's some things that could probably be just improved. Like I said, we probably don't need to clock the inserters that are coming from the steel casting here. There's when all the rest of them are clocked. So there's some small improvements that could be potentially made to this, but very, very small. Like I just showed before, we're talking about less than 1%. So in this particular case, just having a very compact layout, good ratio of the mining drills, and overall layout mattered more than even the clocking methods that were ultimately used, even though we talked about them at length. So next, let's go through the on-patch designs. So what you're going to see here on the left-hand side of the screen is the overall performance of them. I want to make a special call out here first. The first 2 designs, the design by Carve Vortex and Mulane, are tested. They're not a real fair comparison. The reason they're not fair is because they overproduce slightly, because their clocks are not perfect in terms of the updates, like the amount that they're producing. So they rely on back pressure to eventually get throttled by overall the production science that is consuming it. So just want to highlight that that's one of the reasons why they're going to perform worse in general. So they both overproduce compared to the rest of the designs. I didn't go back and change that because I did not want to add the complexity that would come from having a flow rate limiter here and having a whole bunch of logic to do that, where I just found like, okay, we could, and I also didn't want to change all the clocks here because that's just a lot to update for another design, especially when they have very complicated wiring that's going everywhere. So to take these 2 results with a grain of salt, but I want to cover a couple things. What I like about Carve Vortex designs in general is that they are using these big mining drills too. And the main benefit of it is you just can get twice the amount of ore out of a patch. Now, that at the cost of it all mining it in one tick, and it's going to have a larger entity update time spike, because this is going to produce 32,000 per second, or 32,000 divided by 60 is going to be 533 per tick. So this is basically in every crafting cycle. This is going to fill the inventory in here once every 5 cycles, whereas this one is running it once every cycle. And you can see that even by the animation time that this is running every single time, whereas this is running once every 5 cycles. So that's when it's actually performing its mining operation. The rest is just draining its inventory. So, but the thing that really inspired me about Mulane's design that I want to give credit to is when I first ran all the benchmarks, this was the best performing 100% patch size design that existed in the competition. And it changed the way that I thought about it. And even with the overproduction, it was the best version at that time. So what I thought was really interesting that changed my perspective on was the fact that it's using 3 furnaces here on a patch, and is not even using like a very high amount of beacons. Now I'm realizing also the way that I placed this is not exactly ideal because this should be here, but it kind of covers kind of a point that was an issue for me with this design, was that it was kind of hard to place in a real patch. So it worked well in this editor patch and I could just barely fit it. Because if you look under here, there's a couple tiles here that there's a gap where it can fit. So I was having a hard time fitting it. So what I wound up saying was like, okay, I really like this concept. Can we redesign it slightly to get these mining drills ever so slightly more in and change the layout a little bit? So that's what I created here. And there's 3 different versions that I created. But I wound up making it so that the distance between these 2 mining drills is just ever so slightly closer. So you're seeing here that this is covering this kind of a distance here compared to this being further out, making it harder. So if you look at these 2 different mining drills, they just are overlaid over top of each other. Means that it's a little bit more compact and easier to fit. So I optimized mainly for the electric mining drills at the cost of me adding more beacons here. Now, you could argue that you don't need an extra beacon here, and you could remove this and have just 5, but I wound up just over beaconing a little bit so that the furnaces run for less time. So it's just a choice that was made here for this. The only improvements that I wound up making over this otherwise was, I know that in general, if you're interacting with a moving belt, it's going to be better to pick up from a straight belt than it is an underground. So that was a difference that I wanted to make here, was I was forcing myself to, I need to be able to pick up from a straight belt. So that's designed here. And then the other thing that I wanted was that it is dropping to a straight belt as well, because there's a slight downside to dropping to an underground belt that's facing forward. Funny enough, if you flip it around and make it go backwards, then the performance characteristic is the exact same as dropping to a straight belt. So just because of the dropping to an underground belt, that was slightly worse. We're talking 1% delta here. So I just wanted to make that change, and I wanted to ultimately try 3 different versions. We've already discussed it, so I won't go over the difference between the different clocking methods on the steel. We know that that's going to be better. So I removed all of those. I removed the clocking on steel, and then ultimately got this final version that was the best I could create that has a perfect clock. The one thing that I optimized for that is different, and again, just to show the relative characteristics so that we can understand kind of the net delta here. So the version that you're seeing over here on the right-hand side is version 2.2. Version 2.2 had a significant drop from 2.1 and also a significant drop from 2.0. The main differences that I made is I removed clocking from things that were unnecessary, and then ultimately got an exact perfect clock on the mining drills. So that was the main thing that I wanted. Exactly input into the furnace, exactly when it actually needs to go and craft. And you'll see that here that this will actually fully run out, but still have enough of the stone bricks here to pull the items out when it actually gets to the point where it runs out. Increasing the mining productivity would have 0 effect on this particular design. The only difference would be that it would just batch when it happens to be mining, to happen now once every second cycle, every third cycle, depending on how high you want to push your mining productivity. But the clock would still output the same amount every single time. So those were the main differences that I made to just improve it, and the total net difference that we got. Again, I'll just compare just my original version that I have here on the left-hand side versus this one, because this one slightly overproduces. So just getting all those clock timings right means I could shave off effectively from the best version about 5% in total. So that actually is a pretty massive difference in terms of that, and just that's kind of demonstrating in this case here, just if you get the clocking exactly perfect on the mining drill, that's going to reduce a lot of the entity update time of it constantly unloading into this particular slot here. So that's improvement that I made that ultimately wound up being real, so that we could see. Now, the rest of the designs here, Akara Vortex wound up creating another design that's over here on the right-hand side that improved ever so slightly from the version that the latest version that I had created here. So this version had a net performance difference of 0.75%. So this is a 1% difference, but still, that means like in total, overall 6% difference from the original version that I had created, right? So just kind of keep that in mind. This design comes with the added cost of slightly higher complexity. By that, I mean that the furnaces are all not crafting at the same rate. So these all have about the same beacons here, 6 beacons apiece. So they're all exactly clocked the same. So then the furnaces, when these are inserting in here, they can wind up being the same rate. The differences here is that the furnaces have different ratios. So this is here 3 furnaces going into 1, 2 furnaces going into 1. So this reduces the number of furnaces and ultimately makes it a better design. And this one is running at a higher speed versus this one running at a slower speed to make up for it. So this still produces the same amount over here, but just add the higher complexity of having to have 2 split clocks, one for the top version and one for the bottom version. And you see that also it's ever so slightly increased in terms of the control network update time, which is actually represented here. Just the control behavior update time is just ever so slightly higher. It's really small. I wouldn't even worry about it, but just that's one of the reasons, it's just due to the clocking. Now you can reduce all of that by just simply going and having one clock that goes across multiple wires and just putting them to all the different patches. It is more complex in that sense because you'd have to route it to more locations and have to move all those wires, but the benefit here is, again, it's using fully the big mining drills. So again, just the drainage is going to be better. So on the resources themselves. So your mileage may vary. Just choose whichever one you want to do. But that leads me to the kind of the bigger point that I want to make. Just because like for me personally, the way that I go and build designs is even if a designer made one that is a 1% improvement over my own design, if I'm going to be putting something in my own base, I'm always going to use my own design because I understand how it works in and out, and that's the one that I'm always going to support and wind up using. So I encourage that too. So you're going to see a lot of different designs that are going to be in this video, and you may or may not want to incorporate them into your own base. So, but what I would say is just take the lessons you learn from this and go and design your own thing. That's the whole fun of Factorio. So don't just take a blueprint that is created by me or by anyone that you see here. Go make your own thing. That's way more fun. So the next thing that I want to talk about is what happens when we get to a larger patch size. So the moment we go to a larger patch size, that's where we start getting even more improvements because we have so many more layouts we can do. We can have large mining drills, small mining drills. We can easily fit it on a larger patch. But now we need to have higher resource settings or higher patch size settings. So when I'm talking about that, just as a reminder, what I mean by that is increasing the size of them. I play at 600%, so but if you don't like that and if you feel like that's cheating, then use any of the designs here that you saw on the left. Now, with that being said, how much of a difference is this that we're talking about? Well, the main differences that come from this is now going to just be purely going to be kind of the number of beacons that you have versus each individual design. So the net difference of going to a slightly higher patch size from the original submission, and this was the best version out of the ones that I sampled from the original submissions for Purple Science, this one wound up being a less than 1% or much less than 1%, a 0.37% difference. This is like noise at this point. This is like a very, very small difference. So this has, again, kind of this shared concept of using multiple assembly machines, which I thought was kind of interesting. Uses 5 assembly machines for 40 per second and is then just clocking them so that they are producing a multiple of 5. 5 is actually a really nice ratio when you think about it here because you need 5 swings from here, 5 swings from here, 5. So it's like it ratio-wise winds up being a really nice consistency in terms of the actual clocks that get put in because it's a very simple window to get the fractions all to line up. So that's kind of a nice thing about the design, and it also is using both big mining drills and small mining drills for this particular design here. So I thought that was pretty cool. Otherwise here, what's going on is, again, you're seeing this compromise of the number of beacons that you can actually realistically get around electric furnaces while still maximizing direct insertion. So it's just the compromise you're making, but you're making such a huge benefit from the actual mining drills going into the electric furnace. And again, this Valence clock was really good here. It wound up usually having it so that it would almost just barely run out and then it would go and refill it again. Now, this is the final design that was the best design. Now, 4 different people collaborated on this. So we had Car Vortex, Theon, myself, and M, who created the actual original layout. This is a unique approach because what it does here is it is using a 2.5 ratio of electric furnaces to the individual assembly machine here. And there's a very specific ratio of where this works. You have to be over 40 per second to craft this. You need 7 beacons per individual electric furnace. And when you look at this, I wanted to test this one out as the final one because this was interesting to me to see what happens when we are sharing a furnace. So this is the kind of the best of both worlds. It's still having less overall furnaces, so it's not a 3 furnace design like I presented over here. It's not a hybrid where it's using 2 and 3, and it is fully using a full 2.5 ratio, and it's extremely compact actually. It's for the size it is, but you do need a much larger patch size in order to fit this, right? So here we're talking about, now we're in the 17, which is the base for 100% designs. We're now in the 30 range in order to get this. So this is like your, I believe like 400% plus to get there. So now how much of an improvement did this make? I wound up creating my own clock for this, and then Phelan pointed out very graciously to me that it did not work if you are not producing 240 per second coming into here, and you're only producing the 200 that you need, which is something you would normally do to clock your red circuits to be exact. So he wound up graciously creating a new clock for this and setting it all up to for this whole entire design here. Now, this design wound up being overall the best, and by how much was it? So you can see here there's almost like no difference between the clock that I had created, even though it's unstable at the red circuit production that's under 240. So just using Thalens, and it wound up being anyway the best in the benchmark run. Great So it wound up being that like it seems like just the clocking method didn't make as much of a difference. It's really the layout that mattered for this. So what you wind up seeing there is that that's where we get that last tiny bit of performance improvement that comes over it. And then we wind up seeing that the percent decrease from Phalen's original design that he submitted to the new version that we created is a 1% delta. So not to be measurable, but not as big of a difference as I originally expected going to a larger patch size. That's kind of exciting to me because that means that in conclusion here too, that the patch size doesn't matter as much as I originally had thought. So that's kind of an interesting discovery that we've made, but it seems like there is a nice thing that you can get finally if you can optimize this to have a nice sharing of these. So really good design, really good layout. Again, this will be in the blueprint pages so that blueprint books so that you can see all the different designs that have been submitted here. So as I wrap this video up, I want you to leave with the following takeaways. So the biggest takeaway from this is direct inserting electric mining drills are going to be the best for two reasons. One, it's eliminating a very expensive operation that's constantly happening, which is this stack inserter constantly picking up off a belt. That's a lot of individual transfers, and picking up items from a belt are expensive, so we get to eliminate that. The second thing that comes about is that we can actually tune the performance of the electric mining drill by clocking it. So by exactly clocking it when this stone runs out, we can actually go and eliminate the scans and the constant transfers that are coming in, which I demonstrated in the beginning of the video. So that's the biggest benefit that you're going to get from this. So going on patch is going to be definitely superior. Now, as far as the other things that you could or could not clock, steel was one that did not matter because all the rest of them were clocked. Now, one that you should be definitely clocking is any time that you won't have a guarantee of back pressure. So this electric furnace, for example, is going to be crafting one item, in this case, 37.5 per second. It's going to craft, on average, we'll just say, just make it simple, 2 items per, 1 item every 2 ticks. So that means there's 30 scans that this inserter has for this particular electric furnace, but also 30 transfers going to pick up every single one of them and shove them slowly into the assembly machine. So the better thing to do there is, okay, that's 30 items that are getting transferred in inventory transfers that are happening. Let's go and eliminate that and batch them all at once. This is a huge improvement. And because this is already swinging 3 times here, that's already an improvement because that's taking those 30 and batching them all into a group of 3. So that's a huge improvement you can make there. Now, otherwise, the output from this assembly machine also makes sense because it's not going to pick up every single one. So these are all different areas to think about. So the things to think about in general, this is why we wound up seeing that clocking the actual stack inserters coming from a belt was just never worth it, just because of the fact that you're going to have already, this is running almost constantly. So you're eliminating 1 scan here, and you're eliminating 1 scan here for the steel inserter and from the stone. Both of those cases are not worth it, just don't clock it. So those are the main things that I want you to take away from this video, and hopefully this was informative so that you can understand some of the things you should clock, some of the things you shouldn't clock, kind of what the characteristics of mining drills are and how they interact and how we can actually tune their performance in order to get the best version that we can for crafting, in this particular case, electric furnaces, but more so hopefully you can take from this video some overall concepts of what you should and shouldn't clock, and also understanding exactly when you're operating with high flow rate with mining drills, you can understand how you can tune their characteristics as well. So with that all being said, I tried my best this particular video to make it as straightforward and to the point as I could. There's a lot to cover in this video, so if you made it this far in the video, I really, really appreciate your attention span and you watching for this long. As always, the results will be included in the video description below, where you can go to my GitHub page and you can see all these different designs, and you can download the save files along with the blueprints as well, if you want to do any further testing. With all of that being said, thank you so much for watching. My name is AbeBuckNasty. Have a fantastic rest of your day.